can do a check, $100. We have a lot of speakers that can't see that. Yeah, that's kind of so we give them. Yeah, all right, sounds good. We'll take care of that after. Hi, I don't met you. Hi, I'm Cheryl. Cheryl, nice to meet you. I'm Laura. Nice to meet you, Laura. Did I see you come in with a child? Yes. Who is that?
That's my daughter. Lily.
Lily.
Yeah. My wife and second daughter stayed at home today. Having a little trouble getting out of bed.
Oh, yeah. That's January for you.
Yeah.
That's my major achievement today is getting out of bed.
Yeah, we were struggling a little bit. I'm not gonna lie. But some of us got here.
So, I'm
Cheryl.
Cheryl. Laura.
I lose, but I tickle him, and then he says, well,
Is it time, Emily? It's time. Is it work? Oh, it's working. More people will be coming in. They just have to get some treats up there because treats did miraculously. Hi, everybody. I'm Laura Sverin. Do several jobs here at Midvale. I want to thank you for coming today. This is our All Are Welcome weekend, and it's tradition that our Pride team here at Midvale usually hosts the adult forum on this Sunday. And the fact that we do All Are Welcome means the world to me. As many of you know, I love dearly someone who is transgender. I just want to point out before I introduce our speakers from the Wisconsin office of the ACLU that we have lots of goodies over here. There are free Pride t-shirts, this version. There's blue and there's black. They're kid sizes, adult sizes. They are totally free. So if you would like one that you can wear on next year's All Are Welcome weekend, take one. If you have one but you want one of the other color, take one. This table back here has materials that come from ACLU Wisconsin. This table behind has stickers, take one, but also a selection of books and pamphlets. There are a couple that are labeled free to take, but the rest are not. Those belong to me personally. They're part of my library. So if something interests you there, take a picture of it on your phone, and then you can find it later. You can also ask me if you would just like to borrow. I'm happy to lend people. I just need to know who has it. One other thing I want to point out there is that Emily pointed out to me on Thursday that a new movie is coming out that's been viewed at the Sundance Film Festival with Will Ferrell and his friend Harper, who transitioned to female at the age of 61 a couple years ago during the pandemic. And that film got rave reviews. It's just them in a car on a road trip across America talking. They filmed 128 hours of footage. There's, the film is not that long. But there's a lot of laughing, a lot of warmth, and also a lot of crying in the car. But that's something to watch for. So on to our speakers. So I would like to introduce to you two staff members from ACLU Wisconsin office. Where is your office, by the way?
It's
Milwaukee. So they drove from Milwaukee. So, and we can pay you mileage. So the speaker with the tan sweater is Amanda Merkwae, and I made contact with her at Madison's Pride Festival last year and asked, hey, can you come and talk about the anti-trans movement happening? And our other helper presenter is Reverend Tina Itson. She's ordained in the United Methodist Church. They've both worked at ACLU Wisconsin for a year and a half. And I'm really excited to have you here. So thank you for letting us know what's going on with this kind of movement. So let's welcome them, everybody.
Thank you so much for having us. Like she said, I'm Reverend Tina Itson. I'm the Development Director at the ACLU. Excited to be here to share a little bit with you. Our agenda today, yes. Can I? Oh, okay. Yes, I can. I can talk louder. We're gonna just set the table a little bit. Amanda's gonna share a lot about the anti-trans legislation that's happening nationwide, as well as bills that are happening here in Wisconsin. And then we'll share a little bit about what you all can do, and then answer some questions. So I'll just set the table here. You know, as a person of faith, you know, sometimes folks are like, "Why do you work at the ACLU?" We're, you know, nonpartisan, non-religious, all of those things. But for me, it's so important. The rights that we have as people and as Americans should be something that is protected, especially rights that are related to who we are as individual people. And I believe that our faith calls us to that. I feel Christ calls us to that. In so many of the stories in the New Testament that relate to, you know, Jesus telling the disciples to protect those who are on the margins, and that is our call as Christians to do the same. And so when we see these things happening in our political life and in our governmental life, it's important for us as people of faith to be able to stand up and say this isn't right, and use the power of the church, which we have lots of power in the church. We have lots of people and folks who are really passionate about these things, to be able to say, we as people of faith feel like it's important for people to be protected, regardless of who they are and because of who they are. And so that's for me. Sorry. That for me is what's really important. I see. So I will pass it over to Amanda to get into the kind of the meat of what's happening around the country.
Thanks, Tina, and thank you again so much for having us today. In the last few years, there has been just a record number of bills at the state legislative level that attack LGBTQ rights, especially transgender youth. And so the ACLU has started tracking these attacks and working with our national network of affiliates and ACLU National to support LGBTQ people everywhere in a number of ways. One is just providing education. Another is kind of direct advocacy at the state legislative level or at the school board level across the country. Another is through litigation. So there are rights that folks have either grounded in state constitutions or the Equal Protection Clause of the federal constitution, kind of requiring that people be treated equally, and that folks who identify as LGBTQ are not denied access to public benefits and services, or an equal opportunity to an education. And so while more states every year work to pass laws to protect LGBTQ people, there still are a lot of these bills nationwide that we've been seeing that specifically target transgender people, target the ability for local governments to add additional protections for LGBTQ people. And also some of these laws are kind of explicitly allowing religion to be used as a basis for discriminating against LGBTQ people. So the map that we have on the board here is from in the calendar year 2023. The ACLU tracked about 508 anti-LGBTQ bills in state legislatures across the country. In Wisconsin, we had quite a few. States are different in the way that they hold their legislative sessions. So a lot of states just have an annual session for 1 year. But in Wisconsin, we have what's called a biennial legislative session. And so the current session we're in ran from January of 2023 and will run all the way through about March of 2024. And so whether it's a legislature that has a 2-year session or with bills that have carried over from 2023, we're only almost 1 month in to 2024, and there are already, and this was just a couple days ago, I think the number is higher now, 341 bills that specifically target anti-LGBT, or that specifically target LGBTQ people. And a lot of those bills are specifically targeting trans folks. And I think it's shocking to see the level of coordination. And a lot of these are just copycat bills. They get introduced in one place, and then they're trying to write the language so that it can just be picked up by legislators in another state and tried to be implemented there. So these are a few headlines just from the last week of things that are happening across the country. And specifically, there are a couple states that mounted a enormous fight against these bills, like in Ohio, where our partners at the ACLU of Ohio and all of members of a coalition fought very hard against the gender affirming care ban for youth, and finally got the advocacy mounted in the governor of Ohio vetoing that bill. But just a few days ago, the legislature overrode that veto, which is extremely concerning. And it's like once the advocacy reaches a peak where the bad thing is still happening, then kind of the tool left in the toolbox is potential litigation to try to overturn these laws that discriminate. In Wisconsin, there have been a whole handful of bills introduced this legislative session, and I was just going to walk through kind of each one that has been introduced, what the status is, and kind of why the ACLU has been advocating against a lot of these bills. One, Assembly Bill 377 and Senate Bill 378. When you see, two bill numbers, the way that our state legislature works is like the Schoolhouse Rock, I'm just a bill. It starts in kind of at the end of the process, an identical bill has to get passed both the Senate and both the Assembly, and the governor has to sign it in order for it to become law. And so every time there's a bill that's introduced, one version is introduced in the Assembly, and then an identical version is introduced in the Senate. And we call those companion bills. But just a brief explanation why there's two numbers next to each one. So there were two bills that were introduced, one targeting athletes at the K-12 level and one targeting athletes at the collegiate level, that would exclude transgender students from participating in the K-12 level, interscholastic, intramural, or club sports teams consistent with their identified gender in public schools, charter schools, and private schools, participating in the parental choice program. And then similarly at the collegiate level, would exclude trans students from participating in teams that are consistent with their gender identity. Yes?
Clarify what they describe as identified gender. What do they call what is it they, could you clarify what their description of identified gender is? That at birth, or how is that?
Yes, so typically the bills are trying to create like a definition of sex consistent with sex at birth, or on a birth certificate is what each of these bills, a component is having that definition codified in state law, that kind of, while each bill contains its own kind of definition for the purposes of the bill, also trying to get language somewhere in the statutes. So if something were to get passed, then it would be kind of a legal basis to try to use that definition for other purposes. But what we know from all of the testimony the last legislative session when these bills were received a public hearing, and also this session, is that excluding trans students from participating in sports teams consistent with their authentic gender identity is unfair and discriminatory for a number of reasons related to the Constitution, But from a kind of human sense, trans athletes just want to participate in school sports for the same reason as anybody else, to find a sense of belonging and social engagement, to be part of a team, and to challenge themselves. And when you look at the data, being trans does not give girls an inherent advantage over girls who are not trans. And I think the alleged concern that's pushing a lot of these bills oversimplifies the biological and environmental factors that impact athlete success. When you look at the research, there's been decades of participation by trans athletes with athletic organizations kind of setting parameters, both like the Olympic Committee to the NCAA to here in Wisconsin at the K-12 level, the WIAA, that have had policies to address the participation of trans students for a very long time. And that, despite decades of participation under these different guidelines, there's simply no categorical dominance statistically by trans athletes. Trans people, like all people, have varying athletic abilities, and by kind of shutting out participation at various levels, just kind of sends these exclusionary and discriminatory messages about trans people not being real men or real women, or suggesting, and this is what is kind of grounded in a lot of these bills, that cisgender people need to be protected from their trans peers and colleagues. This session, there were also bills that received public hearings, and the bill on the left that was a trans youth medical care ban was passed by both the Assembly and the Senate, but then was vetoed by Governor Evers. It would essentially ban best practice medical care for trans youth experiencing gender dysphoria, which, gender affirming care has been deemed medically necessary, evidence-based, and proven to reduce anxiety, depression, and suicide risks among trans youth, and has been supported across the mainstream of the medical community, including national medical bodies like the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Medical Association, the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, the Endocrine Society, American Urological Association, the American Society for Reproductive Medicine, the American College of Physicians, the American Association of Clinical Endocrinology, and the American Psychological Association, to name a few. When this bill received a hearing several months ago at the Capitol, there were a number of the kind of Wisconsin affiliates of those medical organizations that all registered against the bill and provided testimony. Then there was another bill that received a public hearing last week that would establish a civil cause of action, so would allow someone to sue healthcare providers who perform a gender transition procedure on a minor, and it's kind of defined pretty broadly. But the premise of this bill is to kind of provide a chilling effect on the willingness of healthcare providers to follow best practice medical practice, and make sure that those decisions are rooted in the rights of young people and their parents or caregivers, making what is an appropriate medical decision in an individual case, and really inappropriately singles out gender affirming care, which is overwhelmingly, again, supported by the professional medical community. It actually has more safeguards and more robust informed consent requirements than the majority of care that minors receive and that their parents consent to. There is not evidence to suggest that this care results in a larger number of poor outcomes than other forms of medical care that is routine for young people. And according to the American Medical Association, rates of regret among people who access gender affirming treatment are significantly lower than other comparable forms of medical care. The AMA also stresses that access to evidence-based care is vital for trans people who require it. And this bill last week, organizations from Wisconsin in the medical community that have registered against and provided testimony against the bill included Children's Hospital Wisconsin, the Wisconsin Medical College, the Wisconsin Academy of Family Physicians, the Wisconsin Academy of Physician Assistants, the Wisconsin Medical Society, and the Wisconsin Psychological Association. And so it's been frustrating to see so much testimony from experts, from folks whose lives have been dedicated to providing a standard of care to their patients that has just been ignored by the majority of the legislature that continues to push forward these bills despite that evidence. Yes.
Is this in spite of who pays for it? For example, if I'm a parent and I have a child that I want to have some medical care, if I have just a bag of cash, this law I couldn't even pay for it myself? Or it's saying that I can't use government money to pay for it?
So it would just ban the practice altogether, regardless of who is paying for it.
It should be, we should frame this as parental rights, because it's so common to say that we need parental rights in a state like Virginia. I think we need parental rights in Wisconsin too.
And that's a great point of this frame of, you know, the movement of money and advocacy pushing in to provide these discriminatory bills for the LGBTQ community is absolutely using that lens of parental rights to justify their position. But that is absolutely the legal basis for a lot of the challenges in other states, is like, this is the decision of that, you know, that needs to be made between a physician, the parent, and the child. Like, government, get out of our business. And I think that you know, it's but also interesting that is exactly the frame that, you know, the folks pushing this stuff are trying to use, that this is about parental rights. But you know, for them, it's parental rights when it's what they want, that is impacting everybody, not just their own children. Great question. There was another bill related to creating this definition of sex related to placement of incarcerated people. And folks who are trans in the Department of Corrections custody face unimaginable violence from staff, from other incarcerated people. The statistics are staggering when you look at studies that have been done on that topic. A California study found that trans women who are presumptively housed with men were 13 times more likely to be sexually assaulted than cisgender men incarcerated in the same facilities. And there was a 2015 survey finding almost a quarter of incarcerated trans people reported being physically assaulted by other people in custody or by staff. And under state law and under the Constitution, this type of ban would kind of create an equal protection challenge, but also could run afoul of the 8th Amendment to the US Constitution, which prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. The way that, you know, similarly, the sports bills that the WIAA or the NCAA, like, there are guidelines and a process for how individuals are able to play sports. The Department of Corrections has a robust policy that complies with the federal law, the Prison Rape Elimination Act, where the goal is making individualized assessments based on the safety of the incarcerated trans person, but also the safety of staff and everybody else in that facility. And that's what the law requires, that individualized safety assessment that's taking into account kind of the safety of everyone. But what this bill would do is force the Department of Corrections to directly violate PREA and use this definition as a binary way of assigning people to different facilities. Yes.
I just want to point out that the way this is worded proves that they don't understand sex and gender as at all, because they're saying it's distinct reproductive roles as manifested by sex, by basically anatomy, chromosomal makeup, and endogenous hormone profiles. A person can have one set of sex organs, but chromosomally be the other sex. So which one of those are you going to choose, right? And it shows ignorance as they put the bill together.
Absolutely. And, at every one of these hearings, someone who is testifying is bringing up, like, what about intersex people? What about, like, the complete lack of understanding by the authors of these bills about, the definitions they're including. I remember this public hearing, the author of the bill, the way that it works at a public hearing is the person who had the bill drafted goes up and testifies first and explains, why, and then they can get asked questions from the committee members. And Representative Ryan Clancy, who was on the Assembly Committee during that public hearing, he also is a parent of a trans child, was kind of walking through each part of this definition and trying to get the author to explain, like, how do you know do you know what this is for yourself for each of these items? And, couldn't answer. Like, it was obvious that this was, again, copy and pasted from some other state and put forward just as part of this movement. But, have no idea how these items in the bill are actually defined, even though he is the author of the bill, which can be just a ludicrous way to make
Just
law.
wanted to make this comment because since I have to leave early.
Sure.
The other issue, because with PREA, the other issue is though that a lot of the federal enforcement mechanisms are tied to money that they give the states. And the problem is that I work for DOC, and for us to to be truly PREA compliant on everything would cost over 50 times probably than what the federal government would give you. So it's just not, you're basically, even if you have an administration who very much would be supportive of all of it, they can't really do all that they would want because unfortunately we have finite money. And so, I mean, this is probably more an issue for the federal issue than just state related, but and I don't know how much you all work with like national ACLU, but that would be if the federal government truly wants to get something in, like with PREA, is they need to tie money to it and not just you get $20,000 a year. That you get that, $500,000, $1 million. And even that, I mean, look, I work in the smallest portion of DOC in juvenile corrections. Our budget across all of our stuff is still over $50 million. $1 million is nothing.
Right. And
so
that's an excellent point.
So I just wanted to bring that up before. I think in our current administration and DOC is very open to these type of issues and trying to, and I mean, look, that, the idea of zero tolerance, if you're a correctional officer and you're found having sex with an inmate, zero tolerance. I mean, even if it's supposedly consensual, because it's not.
Right.
But yeah, so there, sorry.
No, thank you for that comment that, there is, they don't care. They don't care that this could violate a federal law that could impact DOC funding. They don't care that, in the sports bills, it would put the WIAA potentially out of compliance with Title IX, subjecting individual school districts to potential liability from the Federal Department of Education Office of Civil Rights. They don't care that the collegiate level sports bill would put the NCAA at out of compliance with the NCAA policy and could subject Wisconsin colleges to an investigation by the Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights. A lot of times, well, for each of these bills, if there's a specific kind of money hook that would require the state government to pay for an aspect of its implementation, they do something called a fiscal estimate or a fiscal note. But not always included in that, the cost of implementing a law is like, these are the consequences or the federal money that's at stake if we don't comply with these civil rights protections. And I think a lot of these, especially bills that the governor has expressed, a strong commitment to veto, it's kind of putting them forward for political theater purposes and putting them forward because kind of causing harm in this legislative process is the point, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Sure.
So Tony Evers is clearly on the side of LGBTQ plus rights. Is there a will or an ability to override his vetoes, or are they safe with his vetoes?
So that's a great question that everyone is paying attention to very closely. So in order to override the governor's veto on any bill, the legislature would need a 2/3 majority in each house to override a veto. And we currently, our state Senate, there is a Republican supermajority. There are 33 Republican senators and 11 Democratic senators in the Assembly. There's a 2-vote margin for a Republican supermajority. And so that's a fear that a lot of folks are talking about because for all of these bills, they have been on party line votes. The ACLU doesn't endorse or oppose candidates. We are nonpartisan, but the reality with this bill is that they're doing straight party line votes where Democrats are opposing these and Republicans are voting in support, with the exception of a couple. There have been Republican legislators who have either abstained or not been present for the vote or voted against, but it is just a few. And so in order to override a veto on these, well, they technically, the Republican majority doesn't have the ability to do that in the current numbers. There is the risk of that when procedural shenanigans come into play, where they could say, we're calling a special session tomorrow, like you need those bodies in the room in order to vote no. And so if there was a scenario where not everybody could get back for a vote, like that threat of a veto override is still not, it's not completely out of the realm of possibility.
I'm sorry I came in late because I had to rearrange part of the archives room because the organ is going to be worked on and it will be much better for the organists, but they have to be able to get through there with all the, but anyway, with all that's going on, some years ago, we began to realize the numbers of templates that ALEC was putting out. So with the issues or concerns that they, whomever that they are these also coming out of ALEC in that one is seeing it so much in all areas across the country?
Great question. So I'm not sure if ALEC has done template anti-LGBTQ bills, but similar organizations to ALEC that are pumping out the templates that then, I don't know, I assume there's like some giant anti-LGBTQ legislator listserv and they just send them out and say, here's the template for your state. But the Alliance Defending Freedom and some other national organizations, including, organizations like Moms for Liberty, have been trying to, put the grass tops where they're funded at the federal level by billionaires and then at the local level trying to implement these things. But I'm happy to check on that if ALEC specifically is behind some of these bills, but they're definitely national organizations where if you're looking at the you're zooming out and looking at like the strings of how the money is flowing, I'm sure the same folks that are funding ALEC are funding these efforts, even if they're under a different kind of name pumping them out. One challenge has been that, you know, there's been legal challenges mounted to a lot of these policies implemented across the country where there's been a veto override, or there is a trifecta of 2 state houses and a governor that are of the kind of anti-LGBTQ mindset. But it's getting more difficult. So like in Wisconsin, they're trying to frame the language. They changed the language slightly so that on its face, it might not violate the Constitution, but as it's applied in individual situations would violate the Constitution. And so it can become more and more difficult because they're learning from state to state what has worked and what hasn't, that when it comes here, trying to frame it in a way that couldn't, you know, be challenged on constitutional grounds just on the way that it's written, but instead on the way that it's implemented. And this is one of those bills that, you know, to your point about parental rights and the kind of crusade of parental rights that is for some parents, but not all. There's a parental bill of rights that was introduced, was passed the Assembly, got a public hearing in the Senate committee, and is just awaiting a committee vote that establishes a legal standard with a list of rights that parents and guardians are entitled to relating to education and medical care and records that ultimately provides this legal hook for parents or guardians to sue a public entity, a school district, any other public program for a perceived violation that's outlined in the bill. But one of those that, you know, it's not just impacting an individual child, but potentially everyone's children, are a requirement that parents be given notice of any time in class a controversial subject will be discussed. And the definition of controversial subject in the bill includes instruction about gender identity, sexual orientation, racial identity, structural, systemic, or institutional racism. And, you know, they're phrased so broadly that this, you know, if enacted, everybody's so afraid of what it's like the Don't Say Gay bill in Florida, where you're so scared of violating the thing because you individually or you as a school district could get sued, that it has a complete chilling effect on what is discussed in the classroom for everybody. There is also a requirement in this bill for school staff to dead name and misgender students and not allow staff to honor the names and pronouns of students without like immediately identifying or immediately contacting parents. And so using this frame of parental rights, but really having an impact on all children. Oh, sure. So for someone who is transgender and has a name that they currently go by, that is their preferred name, dead name would be kind of using their previous, like a previous legal name that is not something that they identify as who they are anymore, and kind of that can be very, I think, harmful once folks have presented as their true selves and against their wishes, folks continue to use a previous name.
I kind of think of dead naming kind of analogous to, and I'm going to use Jocelyn Riley, her husband, his last name was Steele. If somebody insisted on calling you Jocelyn Steele, right, and you say, I don't use that name, I use Riley, but they insisted on calling you Jocelyn Steele, or vice versa, right? So somebody call you, I've taken my husband's last name. If somebody insisted on calling me by my quote unquote maiden name, I'd say, I don't use that name. I don't even identify with that name anymore. Now I'm Laura Svarin. So that kind of gives you kind of a more like emotional understanding of what it means to a trans person to be dead named.
And So this bill ultimately, would have a chilling effect on educators' ability to discuss critical historical topics that might fall under these very broad definitions, and topics impacting LGBTQ people, Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, and other marginalized communities. Because ultimately, all students deserve to feel safe and supported at school, and forcing teachers to treat LGBTQ or trans students differently because of who they are not only violates students' rights under the law, but places them like in real life, like in a much, I think of like real life and then like the legal universe, but in like real human life at greater risk of bullying, harassment, and violence. And I think one challenging piece of information that continues to be shared throughout the testimony against a lot of these bills is just the unbelievable rates of anxiety, depression, and self-harm among LGBTQ youth, especially trans youth. And when these bills got public hearings, there was an incredible outpouring of support and testimony, and folks who turned out for these hearings, sense of community at the hearings, which was beautiful. And there were a number of trans youth and trans adults that, testifying at the Capitol is traumatic on any bill. The Capitol is not particularly accessible. If you want to testify, sometimes they'll give notice for the hearing 48, 24 hours in advance. That's what's required under the law. And so like on Friday, every Friday now that we're in like the silly season of the legislature, it'll be like Friday afternoon, and then it'll be like a dump of all of these hearing notices for like Monday, Tuesday, or Wednesday of the following week. And so practically what's happened over the last several months with these bills is you'll get a day or two notice before this hearing, and people are, worried about their, the legislators are trying to legislate them out of existence. And so they drop everything, they take off work, they somehow have to get transportation to the Capitol to find parking at the Capitol. I have not had one time that I have parked at the Capitol for a hearing and not gotten at least one parking ticket throughout the day, because there's no parking that is particularly accessible or super close. And then you sit there and they purposefully schedule these bills. So, there might be a laundry list of bills that they're hearing. They know the ones that are going to get a lot of people to turn out to testify. They'll put it last on the agenda so that people are sitting there for literally 8 hours just waiting to beg these legislators to acknowledge their humanity, and thinking about the trauma in that process of sitting for 8 hours listening to like the anti-LGBTQ not grounded in science or reality rhetoric from the authors of these bills, but also even the supporters of the bills that are sitting there talking about the real risks of self-harm and suicide for LGBTQ people, and having to sit there as, a person who might be directly impacted, hearing that over and over and over for 8 hours is so traumatic. And so just want to shout out all of the directly impacted people that went through that over and over and over for every single one of these bills. And a lot of, Fair Wisconsin is an organization that did a lot of work to organize kind of support rooms during each of these days of hearings, where people could just go and be in a supportive community with snacks and water and encouragement and help if someone wanted to, draft testimony, and just like words of affirmation, because the process itself is so harmful. And that's, I think, for any marginalized group of people whose rights are being legislated away. I think of, for us, we work a lot with criminal legal system reform issues, and it's the same issue there of folks who, are formerly incarcerated and maybe have spent their whole lives after they've gotten out trying to clear their name, trying to get a fresh start. and then they hear, here's a bill that could directly impact my rights or the people that I love that are, still ensnared in the system, and they go, they, take off work, get a parking ticket, sit there for 8 hours, and then live on Wisconsinites streaming to be, recorded forever. They're putting their story out there after they spent this whole time after being out trying to just like get their good name back. And so just wanted to acknowledge that politics are disgusting, but the process itself can be so harmful, which is why it's so important for, in whatever capacity folks have, finding ways to stand against these bills, because it is just really difficult for directly impacted people to shoulder that burden on their own. One thing I wanted to show, if you want more information about these bills, if you go to the ACLU of Wisconsin website, we have a little bill tracker. So if you click the legislation page, it'll include a bill tracker where you can sort by different topics, things that are related to LGBTQ rights, or all of the other issues that the ACLU has been doing advocacy on. Also, our legislative website is a great place to start, even just making sure you know who your legislators are, and it'll spit out their phone number and their email address on that front page of the legislative website. Because in addition to the kind of explicitly anti-trans bills, there are also a whole host of bills related to classroom censorship, for and book banning, and trying to define, creating a definition of obscenity that is so broad to try to encompass at the local level LGBTQ content. There's a bill that would criminalize librarians for disseminating like obscene content, which is defined in a very broad way that is just like, librarians are terrified. Like, we're living in a world where even in the state of Wisconsin, where, we have a governor who has made expressed, promises to veto these types of harmful bills, that looming threat of a potential veto override with like procedural tomfoolery that is always hanging over people's lives, whether they're directly impacted or they are a public servant like a librarian, just trying to be a community hub, is just very, very real. Also wanted to bring up litigation. So 2 cases to highlight is one that we were directly involved in, Doe v. MMSD, where Madison Metro School District had guidance that the school district implemented, essentially, directing staff to provide support for trans, non-binary, and gender expansive students. And some parents tried to anonymously sue, saying this violated their rights, but ultimately the case was dismissed and was appealed a couple times over the course of several years, but it ultimately resulted in the Madison Metro School District policy being upheld. And then another note of a recent kind of litigation victory on behalf of the ACLU is in Indiana. They implemented, a school district implemented a discriminatory restroom policy, and it was ultimately appealed to the federal Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals that covers Indiana. So like a ruling that they make covers Indiana, Wisconsin, and Illinois. And they issued a decision striking down this discriminatory policy, then went up to the US Supreme Court, who declined to hear the case, which means that the decision of the Seventh Circuit protecting the rights of students was upheld. It was really grounded in the fundamental right of every student to a safe and inclusive learning environment. This isn't going to stop, and it's part of a coordinated effort, I think is the theme. So there's a great trans journalist named Aon Reed, who is someone that I follow every day on Twitter. I don't want to call it X. I don't know. I'm still on Twitter. But she is excellent. She's following a lot of the efforts across state houses and kind of like live tweeting hearings and getting a lot of scoops on kind of what is happening behind the scenes at the national level. And on the 27th, which I think was yesterday, what's today, the 28th? So just yesterday, she was reporting on this leaked audio from lawmakers in Ohio and Michigan, like making clear that the end game is banning trans care for everyone, essentially legislating trans people out of existence. And so it is a coordinated effort. It is a death by 1,000 cuts situation where they first say, no, we're just talking about kids and this is about, but it's like, that's not what they're aiming for. They are trying to, from drag bans to bathroom bans to sports bans, like it is a coordinated effort that they intend to apply to not just children, but adults.
So yeah, what can you do? What can we all do? Some things, obviously, follow us on socials, on emails. You can get connected with us. The work that Amanda and her team and others across the country were getting that information out to folks. It's so important to have trusted messengers with information nowadays. So, ACLU has a lot of the cutting edge on what's happening across the country. And like Amanda said, follow and support trans journalists. It's important to hear these stories from the perspectives of the people that are directly impacted. And so that is another place to be connecting to this work. And so all of our social contact information pieces there, and we'll get stuff sent out so that if you want to do that, you can. But those are a lot of places to connect with information. Other things you can do is support trans people. Things like mutual aid. Know where you invest your money. Some of the things that you personally can do is make decisions on how you spend your money, where you shop, where you go to the dentist, where you get your eye doctor. Are there people that you can support individually and personally through capitalism, which we know is problematic, but we're all a part of this system. And so how are we spending our money and where is that support going? And then supporting organizations that support trans folks. Lots of organizations here, the ACLU of Wisconsin as well, being able to, unfortunately, it takes funds to do this, to have this kind of fight. And the other side is very well funded. And so making sure that we are able to be there to fight against these horrible bills and support folks along the way. So, find a place to support in whatever way that you can. And then taking action there, this is a thing sometimes as church folk, we're not used to this process. I know this last year was the first time I got to testify at the Capitol, and it just finding the room. That place is crazy. But being able to show up to testify or submit written testimony, like we do a lot of trainings for folks. There's other organizations as well here in Madison, the Wisconsin Council of Churches are often getting people motivated to go. And so if you have the time, learn how to testify, try it out once, or at least go and observe, see what it's like. It's a really interesting experience, and it is something that can really make a difference, at least if not to the committee who is sitting there, it can make a difference to those impacted folks who are in the room, to hear people of faith standing up and supporting them. It really does make a difference. Amanda, you want to talk a little bit about contacting your legislator and
Sure.
school board?
So on every issue, contact your legislator often. That is their job, to be responsive to their constituents, and whether that's responding to something that they posted on social media or sending them an email, that is their obligation to take that feedback. And when legislators are on the floor, like the full assembly or the full Senate, trying to figure out, trying to explain how something would impact their constituents, constantly they're trying to quantify the volume of support or opposition to a particular bill. And so it's all the more powerful, even if you're sending a short email, please vote no against this bill, I think it would be harmful, please support this bill, like I think this would be helpful. It gives them that data, so when they're kind of debating the bill, they can say, I've had 90 contacts from constituents in the last day, and 88 out of the 90 told me that I should oppose this bill, and that is the direction that my constituents want me to take on a number of issues, but especially these bills. But also we're seeing how these issues, because of this national coordination, is playing out at the local level with school boards, and also library boards is a big one. We have a resource on our website for how to engage with elected officials generally, but it's more geared towards folks in the legislature. We're in the middle of working on a toolkit of sorts related to school board advocacy, because that is where a lot of these, things that will be vetoed at the state level, they are going to try to implement at the local level. And so even just having one person testifying or emailing school board members can have a tremendous impact. And also vote. Have to remind everybody to vote. We have elections coming up. We have the April 2nd election for local offices. There are some school board offices on the ballot statewide. Also, mayors, city councils, county boards, county executives, a referendum on the ballot in April. A primary election will be held on February 20th, which will only be for offices that have 3 or more candidates to appear that are running for offices for that April election. So just make sure that you're kind of researching, especially those local offices where there isn't a whole lot of information. Can be helpful to go on myvote.wi.gov, click what is on my ballot, see what is on your ballot, and if there are school board candidates where maybe there isn't a lot of press about that particular race, do your homework, even just peeking on their social media accounts or their campaign page to get a sense of is this are there keywords you can pick up on to determine whether they would are about an inclusive school community for everybody, or not so much.
Any other questions?
I taught elementary school for 40 years, 30 of those years in Verona. Tony Evers was our superintendent. In elementary school, the kids didn't really care who played on which team. They played kickball. There's no professional kickball. There's no boys kickball and girls kickball. And sometimes I think we overcomplicate some of those things, or we try to make a rule that goes from kindergarten through college. And we need to look around and say, do other countries settle this differently? Do other schools, do other grade levels handle this? My grandchildren, my granddaughter had opportunities in sports that her grandmother didn't have. And so Title IX is really good. But she played flag football where my grandson played tackle football. And it just seems like there are gradations and options that we miss when we dig ourselves in and say there's got to be a rule for every sport, every kid, every level. And sometimes those rules aren't the best goal, in my opinion.
Absolutely. Thank you for your service as an educator. Appreciate that deeply. I come from a long line of teachers in my family, and it is it's like when you are, what I think is so challenging is teachers, library, everybody's afraid to just do their jobs like they know how to do, with the expertise of child development and understanding how, like, back to the real life, how kids interact with one another. And yeah, we're adults trying to create more rules for an ideological stand that they want to take that doesn't reflect the realities of the student experience. And I think kids these days, inherent acceptance of one another, like the default setting, it seems, at least from young people I've interacted with recently, is they're inherently accepting and inclusive. And it's these adults who I think can't handle the fact that they can't, control every aspect of a child's life and their belief system. That is what is behind it. It's the adults. Like, I've never in my life seen a student speak at a school board meeting and say, you know what I think needs to happen is these books are inappropriate. I think you should take them off the shelves. I shouldn't see them. I've never seen that, ever. It's adults trying to impose their belief system on all students instead of, individual conversations with their child about what they're reading. There's another bill that would give parents automatic notification of every single thing that a child checked out of the library. Ooh, like that's pretty extreme, when already under the law, a parent is able to access their child's, library records and, can be just having those conversations like a normal person. But instead, it's a jump to creating this rule that's solving a problem that isn't a problem.
I just wanted to say, all in all, it's a power thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's a power thing. And the whole idea is to have fewer and fewer people who have the power, whatever the power might be, wherever. And so it's back to always being vigilant and but keeping in mind, it's always a power thing.
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
I also was an educator briefly, just for a couple of years. I taught middle school social studies, and I taught 8th grade civics and 7th grade US history, but my starting unit for both grades was just called power. We talked about all the different types of power, the forms, how they manifest, because that is the root of everything. Who has power? How long have they had power? Why do they have power? Should they keep power? Who should have power instead? Because that's at the root of everything.
Hi, I just wanted to say thank you for doing this. With my business, I do permanent hair removal, and the transgender community is a huge piece of my business. I work with teenagers all the way to retired people and walking with them through this journey. And until you can actually sit down and get to know a person as a person, I feel like anybody who is drafting any of these should have life experience first of dealing with a human being, because maybe you don't have anybody immediately in your family, but maybe your grandchild will be, maybe a partner of your child will be. And until you can actually get to know a person as a person and hear their stories and watch them struggle through this, it's really, for me, very heartwarming that they walk this journey with me. I feel very honored to be a part of that with them. So I appreciate and I totally understand. If you're not affected by it immediately, it's easy to just dismiss it. But when you look at the broader spectrum of life, everybody deserves a right. And I've dealt with incarcerated people, all the way to the teenagers who are just starting this walk with their parents. And so,
Yeah, I think it's so important for us to remember the human aspect. It can, even for us, it can get easy to get like sucked into the policy and to the rules and the game and the thing and all of it. But when we, even at those moments when we are in the midst of policy writing or in the midst of testifying and whatnot, is to remember that there are human beings attached to all of this, and that's who we should be keeping central. And centering people's experiences and those who are impacted, because at the end of the day, those who are impacted by all of this are the ones who have to deal with the repercussions. And so for us to keep that, centered in what we do.
Well, it looks like our time is up, and that seems like a great button to end it on. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us.